Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this How To Academy and Penguin Live event. I'm thrilled to welcome back to this very stage a man whose ideas have changed many lives, including undoubtedly many of us here in this room tonight. Dr. Gabor Maté's The Myth of Normal was 10 years in the making and is already a bestseller in 4 countries. Please give him a huge welcome.
Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the How To Academy in organizing this event. I'm really happy to be here in the UK talking about my new book, which took me 10 years to write and 100 years of misery to finish. I was going to frame this tonight to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be a human being, because ultimately that's what this book is about. I'll quote from the last chapter. As many of you know, I'm of Hungarian Jewish origin and nearly lost my life at a year of age. And the person who organized that genocidal extinction of Hungarian Jewry was Adolf Eichmann. I'm quoting here from the very last chapter. Prior to his trial for war crimes, the master engineer of Nazi genocide, SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, was certified as normal by several psychiatrists. More normal at any rate than I am, one of them was said to have explained, according to Hannah Arendt's classic account. Another, Arendt reported, had found that Eichmann's whole psychological outlook, including his relationship with his wife and children, his mother and father, his brothers and sisters and friends, was not only normal, but most desirable. Now that little fact ought to make us consider what the heck normal actually means. Because this is the man who helped to organize the mechanics of millions of people going to their deaths. And he was considered to be normal. So our idea of normal is very much reflective of what you're used to. In a medical sense, there's a normal range of conditions outside of which this life is not possible. So beyond a certain range of temperature or blood pressure or blood acidity, for example, we don't live. So the normal range then is identical with what's healthy and natural. But it's very dangerous to make that assumption that what we consider to be normal in our society is actually healthy and natural. And my argument that it is not. My argument is also that what we consider to be normal is simply what we're used to. And Tolstoy in his Anna Karenina, how does he put it? He says, there's no condition to which a person cannot grow accustomed, especially if he sees that everyone around him lives the same way. From that, it follows that we just think that the way we're living, because we're all living the same way, is just the way it needs to be. And we make our assumptions about life and about human nature itself and existence based on what we're used to. And we don't realize that what we're used to is very much conditioned by particular historical circumstances and social economic factors, the larger political picture, the multi-generational history of our families and our communities. So we just assume that whatever's going on is the only way that life can be. So Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher in the 17th century, made the famous statement that life is short, nasty, and brutish. He should have said short life, short, nasty, and British, because what he was talking about were the conditions of his time, at the time of the ending of feudalism, the rising of industrial capitalism, the terrible suffering imposed on ordinary people, the class conflict. Life seemed that way to him, but he thought he was talking about life in general. He wasn't. He was talking about life in a particular context. And so what we consider to be normal is also comes out of a particular context. And it's based on that context and our experience of it that we make our decisions about what we consider to be human nature, for example. So in this society, it's quite common to say, if somebody's being greedy and selfish, manipulative, dishonest, we'll say, oh, that's just human nature. Interestingly enough, when somebody's being generous and giving and kind, we never say, oh, that's just human nature. But actually, which is more genuinely human nature than the other? Well, what I'm saying to you is that what we consider to be human nature is very much conditioned by the society that we live in and the values that it imposes on us. It was Aldous Huxley in his Brave New World who said that, well, I'm quoting a character in Brave New World called the Director. He's one of the elite. He's one of the enforcers of the system. And that, put the Director sententiously, that is the secret of happiness and virtue. Liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at making people like their inescapable social destiny. Now, in this society, we consider that we're actually free agents and we live in a time when we can make all these choices and there's no constraints. Maybe, but maybe not. Now, we may not be gestated in the test tube and biochemically programmed like the characters in Brave New World, but that doesn't mean that we're not under the influence of external factors that give us a certain view of ourselves and a view of society and a view of life and a view of others. It doesn't mean that we actually have a spontaneous and free relationship to these questions of who are we anyway. It may be that we're very much also the products of social conditioning in a much more sophisticated and kind of spontaneous fashion than the characters in Aldous Huxley's novel. In an ant colony, interestingly enough, there's the queen and then there are the worker ants. And the workers, and this is amazing to realize, genetically they're identical with the queen. The queen can ovulate, she's bigger, and she lives longer, but she's got the same genes as the worker ants. So what determines how those genes get triggered and expressed and activated has to do with the needs of the colony. So if you take the queen out of the colony, some of the worker ants will actually go to battle to become the queen. And the one that does then starts to ovulate. Their biology completely changes. And they'll be bigger and they'll live longer. So the biology of the queen is actually determined by the needs of the colony. Now, we're not as determined by group dynamics as ants are. And we're certainly genetically we're not identical like ants are. But this idea that we're sort of separate individuals fully in control of our destinies is really a myth. And the great trauma psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk said that as much as we're told that we're separate individuals, we actually barely exist as individuals. And this goes back very much to ancient spiritual teachings, the difference being that those spiritual teachings have been validated now by modern science. So the idea that everything influences everything else is not a new concept. The Buddha said 2,500 years ago, consider the interconnected co-arising of all phenomena. He said, think of all the conditions that go into making a leaf or a raindrop. So, a leaf has in it the sun, the photosynthesis, the play of light, and the interaction of light with the chemistry of the plant. The leaf contains the earth in terms of minerals, and of course the sky, the water that makes up the substance of the leaf. So in that leaf, in a certain sense, the whole universe is united. And very much the same is true of all creatures in this universe, including human beings. And it's in the nature of human beings that we did not develop as isolated, individual, competitive, aggressive beings. In fact, had we been that way, we never would have evolved. We evolved very much in small band hunter-gatherer groups. I'm talking about going back millions of years now. And even if we just look at the existence of our own species, which has been on Earth for, I think, something like 150, 200,000 years, we lived in those small band collaborative groupings. If the existence of human beings as a species, our current species, Homo sapiens, can be expressed in 1 hour on a clock, then until 6 minutes ago, we lived out in nature in small band hunter-gatherer groups. Collaboratively, children were raised by the whole group, not by individuals, not by nuclearly isolated parents, single or a single couple in a distinct bungalow or apartment, but in a group setting. I'm not arguing for going back to those days. I'm just trying to understand what it is that activates human beings and what is it that makes us ill or what promotes our health. Now, if you wanted to study, you can say of an elephant, if you observe an elephant, you might say that the elephant is a solitary, lazy creature who basically lies around the whole day and every once in a while gets up to eat something and maybe walks around a little bit, back and forth, and then lies down again. And that'd be true of the elephant in the zoo. But it's not true of the elephant in its natural state. So to make assumptions about human beings and how we are and who we are in the context of modern society is in a way like making conclusions about an elephant in a zoo. Far divorced from our natural origins and following pathways and practices and holding beliefs and values that are very different under which we actually evolved as a species. Now, it's not that anybody wants to or would want to go back to hunter-gatherer days, but it is a matter of recognizing what maybe we've lost in the process. And the question is, can we use our ingenuity, our creativity, our incredible technical knowledge, our inventiveness for the benefit not just of relentless progress in a very narrow technological, economic sense, which progress, by the way, as we know in today's world, is leaving a lot of people behind. To look at figures in Britain about rising poverty, for example. But even if we assume that this continues progress, at what price? And is it possible to use the same ingenuity, creativity, and progress not to lose and leave behind those values that actually helped humans become humans, but to somehow reconcile modern living with those ancient values of connection and belonging. And belonging is not a minor issue. Loneliness, for example, extreme loneliness has been shown to be as much of a risk factor for illness as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's significant. And in the modern world, there's been an epidemic of loneliness to the point that at some point here in Britain, they appointed a minister for loneliness just to try to try and mitigate some of the impact of the loneliness that modern society has created. And when you look at the statistics, more and more people are feeling lonely. This is rising decade by decade by decade, which brings me to the point of my subtitle in this book, The Myth of Normal. I've already addressed that one. The false equation with what is the norm with healthy and natural. But the subtitle is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And the question of the toxicity of a culture is very simple. To what degree does it meet the needs of human beings? And to what degree does it perhaps undermine the genuine needs of human beings? And that then brings me back to the question of human nature. Well, is there a human nature then that we can actually say this is human nature in terms of this is behavior is representative of human nature and that behavior is not? Well, the answer is there's no such rigid definition of human nature that you can possibly apply. Because if you think of the existence of a Buddha or a Jesus or the existence of a Hitler or a Stalin. I could give other names more modern, but I'll leave modern politics aside to save people tender prejudice, just to protect people's tender prejudices. But the point is, if a Buddha and a Jesus can be human beings, and so can a Hitler and a Stalin, then what does that say about human nature? Which is human nature? The fact is, neither is human nature. We cannot talk about human nature in a fixed, rigid sense. What we can talk about, though, is what creates a Stalin and what creates a Hitler. What creates a Buddha, what creates a Jesus. We can talk about that. And when we talk about that, what we're really talking about is, what are the needs of human beings, and what conditions are necessary for the development of human beings who are self-aware and compassionate, and what conditions support the development of human beings who are utterly egomaniacally selfish and self-centered and utterly brutal. So we cannot talk about human nature as such. As a matter of fact, the neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky at Stanford University has said that the nature of our nature is not to be particularly constrained by our nature. That's our nature, is not to be constrained by our nature. We're infinitely adaptive creatures. We can adapt, as the Tolstoy quote indicates, we can adapt to almost anything. Now, adaptations can be very healthy, or they can be healthy in a particular context and unhealthy in a different context. Which is where I'd like to say a moment about something about this whole question of genetics and illness, and genetics and human behavior in general. There's been a modern trend to find a gene for anything. Some comic wrote about 30 years ago, they're finding a gene for everything. A gene for line dancing, a gene for liking British food, a gene for everything. But the reality is, when you actually examine, and President Clinton, when he announced the Genome Project, he promised the world that through these genes, we're going to find the language of life. And we're going to find out exactly why people get diabetes, why they get Alzheimer's, why they get everything, and we'll be able to prevent and treat these conditions. That was back around 2000 or 1999, something like that, I think. Well, we found out since then that we haven't found anything of the sort. The Genome Project has yielded virtually zero in terms of the prevention of human illness. And why is that? Because genes don't determine a whole lot in terms of human behavior or human health. There are some diseases that are specifically genetic. One runs in my family, it's muscular dystrophy. If you inherit the gene, like my mother and my aunt did, then you're going to have the disease. But those diseases that are genetically determined are extremely rare. And most conditions that beset human beings are either, most of them are not at all genetically determined, and even those that have some genetic predisposition, that predisposition still depends on the environment to trigger them or not to. So you can take something like breast cancer in women, and there's some breast cancer genes. If you inherit the gene, your risk of getting that disease is much higher than the average. But out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 carry the gene. 93 do not. Out of 100 women with the gene, not all of them will get the disease. No, they're a much higher risk, no question about it. It just means that, for the most part, genes don't determine illnesses. What then does? And by the way, this is true for whether we're talking about most physical illnesses and mental illnesses. So to talk about genetics is kind of a lazy person's way of trying to explain something, because scientifically, there's very little basis to it. So for example, all these genetically determined mental health conditions, they say about ADHD, which is something I've written about after my own diagnosis in my 50s, that it's the most heritable mental illness there is. Well, as I say in this book, to say that ADHD is the most heritable mental illness is like saying that quartz is the most chewable crystal. because it's not true. It's neither a disease nor is it genetic. Nobody has ever found a single gene that determines any mental health condition. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that determine any mental health condition. Nobody has ever found a group of genes that if you don't have them, you will not have a certain mental health conditions. There are a large group of genes that the more of them you have, the more you risk, and more at risk you are for any number of mental health conditions, but no specific ones. Which means that the genes cannot cause the disease, because if they did, when they showed up, so should the disease in every case, but it doesn't. And you can have the same disease, or if you want to call it that, but even without the genes. Because the fact is, scientifically speaking, that genes are turned on and off by the environment. So it's a question of what kind of environment is acting on certain genes that'll promote one kind of development or a less healthy kind of development. And that again comes back to the social context. It's in the social context, in our set of relationships with our parents, beginning in utero, where the emotional stresses on the mother will already have an impact on the developing brain of the child and the physiology of the child. The birth process, the birthing process, the child-rearing environment, these are the conditions under which we develop in healthy ways or we don't. And my argument is that in this culture, it's increasingly a toxic environment that distorts human development. So if you want to understand why more and more kids are being diagnosed with everything under the sun and being medicated for it, for that matter, or if you want to understand why there's a inexplicable rising tide of childhood suicides in the United States, about which there's a lot of hand-wringing, but very little insight. Well, if you want to understand the New York Times article that 6 weeks ago revealed that there's one teenager who's on 10 different psychiatric medications. 10 different? They should maybe be on one, if at all. 10 different psychiatric medications. Well, what accounts for the rising tide of addictions or autoimmune disease? Either you assume that these are all genetic conditions, which, by the way, even on the face of it cannot be true, because genes don't change in a population over 10, 15, 20, 30, or 100 years. So if something is rising, whatever's doing it, it cannot be genetic. If the rate of multiple sclerosis, the gender ratio, which in the 1930s used to be close to 1-to-1 between males and females, is now more than almost 3.5 women to every man. Whatever's causing it, it can't be genes. There's nothing that determines that it should be that way. So we can make 3 assumptions. Either these are genetic conditions, which they're not, or we can assume that these are random, inexplicable events, misfortunes that somehow strike people for no reason whatsoever that we can discern, which is basically the medical understanding, because we call these conditions idiopathic, like autoimmune conditions and so on. Idiopathic means we don't know what causes it. Or we can say, well, maybe there's something in the environment that is triggering the onset of all these conditions of ill health that show up in mind and body. And if, since the numbers of these conditions is rising and the number of people being affected by it is rising, then just as in a laboratory, if you're growing organism in a lab culture and many of them got ill, you'd have to say this is a toxic culture. There's something about this culture that's making the creatures that live in it sick. I'm making the same argument about the culture that we're living in today. I mentioned multiple sclerosis. In 1870 or so, or 1860 perhaps, the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who first described the condition, said in so many words, well, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, that this is a stress-driven condition. He said this 150 years ago. Sir William Osler, the Canadian physician, knighted by Queen Victoria. I think he taught at Oxford. He also was one of the founding physicians at Johns Hopkins in the United States. He said that rheumatoid arthritis was a stress-driven condition. In 1870, the New York Times, about 6 months ago, had an article. They've done some study that showed that women with breast cancer, the more depressed they were, the worse their prognosis was. In other words, there was a relationship between the emotional state of the woman and the outcome of her illness. And the New York Times thought this was amazing news, except for the fact, when you look at the medical literature, in 1870, for God's sakes, there was a British surgeon called James Paget who said the same thing. Now, the difference is that from the time that Jean Martin Charcot made his observations and William Osler made his, and James Paget observed what he observed, at that time there was no research to back it up. There was no research either to show the correlationship between stress and trauma and adult illness, or illness in general, nor was there research, nor was there the scientific knowledge to explain the physiological pathways between stress, emotional difficulties, and physiological illness. We didn't have the science. No, we do. We've had multiple studies now to show the relationship between stress and trauma and multiple sclerosis. We've had multiple studies showing the same relationship between these same conditions and rheumatoid arthritis, or, for example, malignancy. A study came out of Harvard 3 years ago, I think, that showed that women with severe post-traumatic stress disorder have double the risk of ovarian cancer. Now, if that was the only study ever done, it should have sent every physician running to figure out what's going on here. What's the relationship between an individual's emotional states and their trauma and their physical health? But you know what? The study barely registered on the medical radar. And you'll never go to a gynecologist and be asked, what happened to you? Endometriosis, a condition of women that has to do with uterine tissue showing up in parts of the abdomen where it doesn't belong. It's a painful condition. It's associated with infertility, and it's also elevates the risk for cancer. Studies have shown that women who are sexually abused in childhood have a higher risk for endometriosis. But you go to a gynecologist, nobody's going to ask you about childhood trauma. So, on the one hand, we have this gathering and accumulating medical evidence, scientific evidence. On the other hand, we have a medical system that completely, I can't even say it ignores it, because to ignore something, I have to be aware of it. I mean, I can't ignore you unless I know you're there. They're not even aware of it. Most physicians are not. This is not a knock against individual physicians. I'm talking about a system here. Because this system separates the mind from the body. Not just the medical system. The whole ideological system of this culture separates the mind from the body. The medical system simply buys into the ruling ideology from that perspective. The tragedy is that these are not theoretical considerations. They have to do with what is necessary for healing. What is necessary for healing. And people who, this is documented. By the way, let me ramble a bit. In 1938, there was a Hungarian physician at Harvard. His name was Soma Weiss. Very revered medical teacher. Revered to the point that to this day, there's an annual research day in his honor at Harvard. And Soma Weiss told a medical school class that emotional factors are at least as important in the causation of physical illness as physical factors, and they must be at least as important in the treatment, said Soma Weiss in 1938. This lecture of his was actually printed in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1940. I didn't know about it. I found out about it as I was writing this book. So that's 1940. The mind-body unity that Semmelweis and some of his pioneering predecessors intuited without knowing the actual science of it. Now we have the science of the mind-body unity. It's not even controversial that emotions are part and parcel of the same apparatus that runs our immune system. What happens to us emotionally has impact physiologically. It's just scientifically obvious, not controversial, and completely ignored in medical practice, to the point that as I read that article about Weiss, or his article, at the same time I was talking to a medical colleague at Harvard. His name is Dr. Jeff Rediger, and Jeff is a psychiatrist. He's the head of one of the departments at McLean's Hospital at Harvard, and he himself has written a book called that's somebody else. He wrote a book called Cured, something about the amazing science of spontaneous remission. And spontaneous remission is when people have a terminal disease and medical treatment fails, or the individual refuses medical treatment, and yet the individual heals, the disease goes away, and decades later they're alive and fully healthy. And so Rediger documented these cases in that he studied them and he looked at the medical records, so that wasn't just stories. I have several such stories myself where people are either are told that they're going to die of their disease and then they don't. But in any case, Jeff told me that to talk about mind-body medicine to this day at Harvard is to jeopardize your career. He said it's getting better, but it's still very, very difficult. Still very, very difficult. Well, that's kind of strange, isn't it? That on the one hand there should be all this science, all this insight, all this evidence, and on the other hand, we don't follow it in practice. We can ponder as to why not, but I don't want to go into it right now. I'd rather get on to a related topic here, which is then, what is it that makes us ill? So, given the mind-body unity, we just have to look at people's emotional lives, not as the only cause of an illness, but as a significant contributing factor. And the reason it's important to look at that, because that's one of the factors that we can change. Just like we can change somebody's diet for the healthier, just as we can suggest that people change their relationship to their bodies in terms of exercise and rest and sleep and getting fresh air and all that, we can also address this significant contribution to disease that Semmelweis pointed out is at least as important as physical factors in the causation of illness, and should be at least as important in the treatment. Now, what is the essential psychological factor that I have found, at least, and not just me, by the way, contributes to the onset of illness? What it is separation from ourselves, a disconnection from ourselves. And what I'm talking about here is about trauma. Because the impact of trauma is to disconnect us from ourselves. And that's adaptive. That's actually adaptive. If conditions are such that the child is suffering in a way that's not being helped or alleviated by nurturing adults, and the child is alone with the suffering, it's unbearable. So you disconnect from your body, and you disconnect from your emotions. And that disconnection is the essence of trauma. That disconnection has then physiological consequences and mental consequences. Now, excuse me, take a condition like depression, for example, said to be this genetic biological brain disease. Is it? Well, biology is certainly involved, because we know, as I've experienced personally, that if you're very depressed and if you take antidepressant medication, changing the biology of your brain, that can actually make you feel better. So that's true. There's some biology involved here. But we can't jump from that fact to assuming that biology is the cause of it. Because it turns out that human biology is very much under the impact of the environment, including the emotional environment. In fact, the brain itself develops an interaction with the emotional environment. So I'm not going to find the citation now, but I can quote a Harvard paper that came out in 2012, and it was published in a major medical journal, the Journal of, excuse me. I've been on a 4-week speaking trip and my voice is starting to notice the difference. This article from Harvard said that the human brain develops with a complex process that begins before birth and continues into adulthood. And the most significant factor in shaping the development of the human brain is the quality of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early years. In other words, the biology of the brain itself is significantly determined by the emotional environment acting on the genes. It's not genes or the environment, it's the environment acting on the genes. And the most significant aspect is the emotional relationship with the nurturing adults. And that's where this culture begins its toxic imprint on the human child and the traumatization of the human child. Trauma, to be clear, it's a word that we use rather loosely and promiscuously. On the other hand, we don't use it nearly often enough. So we use it rather too loosely when we talk about difficult experiences being traumatic. You know, I saw this movie last night and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You just were upset. Or you had some sad feelings, or you had some emotional pain. That's not the same as trauma. So as Peter Levine, the trauma psychologist, points out, all trauma is stressful, but not every stress is traumatic. When is it? When is it traumatic? It's traumatic when it wounds us in a wound that lasts. Because the origin of the word trauma is actually wound. It's a Greek word for wounding. And so it's a psychological wound. Now what's the nature of a wound? A wound is, if it's open and raw, it's very sensitive. So if I pat myself on the shoulder here right now, there's no pain whatsoever. But you can imagine if I had a burn, for example, on my shoulder, and I wasn't wearing any protective clothing, and the nerve endings were close to the surface, for which, by the way, we have an expression in English, it's called being thin-skinned. And we tend to sort of look upon people who are thin-skinned. You know who those people are? They're just more sensitive. That's what they inherited genetically. Not any disease, but a sensitivity. Which means that when you tap them even lightly, they hurt a lot more. It also means that with the same genes, if they're treated well, they just become that much more creative, spontaneous, intuitive, and lively than others. The sensitivity doesn't determine illness. It determines your sensitivity to the environment. What happens to you then and how you develop depends on what the environment does to you, what environment you grow up in. And I just lost my train of thought. What the heck? What was I talking about before I started talking about sensitivity? Anybody remember? Oh, the tapping on the shoulder. Yeah, well, that was about sensitivity. Sorry? Yeah. Anyway, so here's the thing. You can hurt people in two ways. So trauma is a wound. Yeah, so the one aspect of trauma, I got it now, is it's an open sore that if you touch it, it really hurts. And it's in the nature of psychic wounds that they don't automatically heal. So you can have a psychic wound that you sustained when you were 6 months of age, or in my case, in the first year of my life. That if it's unhealed, that sensitivity will still be there, or that reaction to that wound will still be there when somebody touches me on that wound 50, 60, 70 years later. And so when, you know, in my particular case, you know, being given to a stranger in the street by my mother to save my life, that wasn't the trauma. The trauma is not what happens to you. The trauma is the psychic wound that you sustain internally. Now, the wound that I sustained when my mother gave me to a stranger, which, when you actually think about it at all rationally, was just an incredible act of love on the part of a 24-year-old young woman whose parents had been killed in Auschwitz, whose only person in her life was me, because my father was away in forced labor. She didn't know if he was dead or alive, and she's giving me up to a stranger to save my life. It's an incredible act of love. But how do I interpret it as an infant? As an abandonment, as a rejection. So the wound is not that I was given to the stranger. The wound is what I made it mean. The interpretation that I formed, which is that I'm being rejected, abandoned, because I'm not lovable, I'm not important, I'm just not worthy. That's the wound. So it's not what happened to you, it's what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. So that can remain an open sore on the one hand, which decades later is touched in my relationship, say, with my spouse, and I talk about that in the very first chapter of this book. So it can remain as an open wound, and that's when we get triggered. Now think about that word, triggered. We talk about triggers all the time, and we think the problem is the triggers. But think about it, metaphorically. A trigger is a small little thing. It only works if there's some ammunition and a weapon and explosive charge there. So when I get triggered, it's not the external thing that's the problem here. The problem is the explosive charge that I'm still carrying, the ammunition. That's what's set off when I'm triggered. Therefore, when I'm triggered, or you're triggered, we can complain about the external event that triggered you. Or you can start wondering, what I'm still carrying? What is the explosive charge? What is the unresolved trauma that actually being activated here? And as Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, says, be at least, that doesn't mean that we should be sitting ducks and sort of willing victims to other people's unacceptable behavior. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean is, when something relatively trivial happens and we make a big mountain out of a molehill, that's because there was some unconscious stuff of a traumatic nature that we haven't resolved yet. And this shows up in relationships all the time. In fact, it's why relationships fail so often. People think that the problem is the other person who's triggering them. They don't realize that they're the ones who are carrying the explosive charge. So that's one aspect of a wound, is its open, hypersensitive nature. What also happens to wounds, of course, is that they form scar tissue. And scar tissue has a protective function, but it also has its restrictions in that it's hard, it doesn't have nerve endings in it, so that there's no feeling in them. So people traumatized very often lose connection to their own feelings. They don't know what they feel. On the one hand, they can feel way too much at a trivial stimulus. On the other hand, often they don't even know what they feel. So there's a disconnection from me, between myself and my actual experience. We also disconnect from our bodies. I mean, if we're hurt in our bodies, if we can escape, terrific. If we can fight back, terrific. But a child being traumatized can do neither. So very often, people traumatized disconnect from their bodies. And I spoke with the luminous author and playwright and a women's activist, Eve Ensler, or formerly known as Eve Ensler. She wrote the Vagina Monologues that some of you might remember. And she wrote this amazing book called In the Body of the World, where she asks, do I have rape cancer? And she did have rape cancer. Her father abused her sexually for a long time as a child. She doesn't call herself Eve Ensler anymore because she doesn't really identify with the name of her rapist. So she's called V now, just V. And one of the ways that V survived her childhood was to disconnect from the body, to the point, she says, there was a tumor the size of a mango inside me. She had severe advanced uterine cancer. She wasn't even aware of it. And it was only after she was operated on and she's gone through a healing process that she reconnected with her body. So that disconnection from the body, from the self, that's the essence of trauma. That disconnection is the essence of trauma, which means that we disconnect from our authentic being in order to survive. Again, it's an adaptation. Nobody's to be blamed for being inauthentic, because being inauthentic is how they survived. If you follow the advice of more than just a few behavior psychologists, parenting experts, you will probably force your child to separate from their true selves. There's two ways you can hurt children. One is by doing bad things to them, like the sexual abuse, physical, emotional abuse, which the Daily Telegraph recommended about 10 years ago in a couple of articles where they pointed out that the problem with our kids today is we stop using the cane in our schools. Let's bring the cane back. Let's traumatize our children in order to get them to behave. You follow that advice, you'll force a child to disconnect from themselves. You don't pick up a child when they're crying, you force the child to disconnect from themselves. So what I'm saying about trauma, it doesn't have to be these big ticket or big T events like abuse. It can simply be modern parenting practices advocated by so many parenting experts that have parents actually ignore their own parenting intuitions in order to enforce certain behaviors on the child. So that's what we call small T trauma, which is not about terrible things that happen to kids, but about the good things that don't happen. And to go back to my concept of the toxic culture, the toxicity of a culture is determined by, does this culture serve or undermine healthy human development? Well, if we understand the needs of the human child, which is for unconditional loving acceptance, a totally secure attachment to nurturing caregivers, such as, by the way, I was not able to provide for my children. So my son, who co-wrote the book with me, thank God, because this is not a project I could have accomplished on my own. He writes in this book about it, a nightmare he used to have as a child, where the floor disappeared from under his feet. And what he was talking about is that in the emotional atmosphere of the home where he grew up in, things were so volatile. He never knew when a very tense and often abrasive conflict would break out within his parents. I'm not talking about physical violence, by the way. I'm talking about emotional stress and strain. And the child immediately feels insecure, lack of safety. Lack of safety interferes with neurological and brain development. And this had nothing to do with whether we loved our kids or not. Of course we did. But you can hurt people. What I'm saying is you can hurt people in two ways. You can hurt them by doing bad things to them, such as the abuse or the wartime or the death of a parent or the parent being jailed. These are the so-called adverse childhood experiences, the ACE studies that, how many of you are familiar with them? The ACE studies, an encouragingly good number here. The ACE studies show that the more there's physical, sexual, emotional abuse, the death of a parent, the jailing of a parent, a rancorous divorce, violence in the family, a parent being addicted or mentally ill or neglect, the more these 10 adverse child experiences show up in the child's life, the greater their risk for addiction, for autoimmune disease, for mental health conditions, and so on. So those are what we call the big T traumas. What they don't talk about, by the way, they should have, but they didn't include factors like racism that a child might experience, or poverty that a child might experience. Those can be very traumatic, with traumatic impact on the brain, actually, traumatic impact on the physiology. There's a chapter in this book. There was a study only 3 weeks ago. I was already on book tour when the study came out. Episodes of racism, the immune system immediately is diminished in its effectiveness, at least for a while. And of course, the stress hormone levels rise, which are a threat to health. So that all these things are not just sort of emotional travails, they actually have a physiological impact. They get underneath the skin, literally. So, in a broader sense of adverse childhood experiences, we must include social factors such as inequality, such as poverty, such as racism, such as genderism. And the more of these factors are present, the sicker you expect people to be, theoretically. And it's also what you find in practice. So, for example, autoimmune conditions are far more likely amongst women, for reasons that I talk about in this book, which has to do with the cultural role of women in the society. Mary Wollstonecraft, early feminist, mother of, I think the mother of, who wrote Frankenstein? Was it Mary Shelley? Yeah, her mother, an early feminist. She talked in the 18th century about how women are forced to suppress their true nature even before they understand their true nature. So this is a culturally imposed phenomenon. You'd expect that the more than race and gender and poverty intersect, if we understand the mind-body unity, and if we understand that our biology is largely shaped and affected by our social conditions and our relationships, then you would expect that in a society where racism is still rife, if you're a woman, if you're poor, and if you're a person of color, you're going to get more autoimmune disease, which is exactly what you get in significant percentages. So that an indigenous woman in Canada, a population who never knew autoimmune disease prior to colonization, an indigenous woman in Canada today with the horrible history and a horrible present in Canada of their situation, they have 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis than that of anybody else. This is in a population that did not used to have autoimmune disease at all. So those are the big T traumas. The small T traumas are where the child's needs that I've outlined, some of them the unconditional acceptance. Another need of the child is the freedom to experience all their emotions. You see, our brains are wired for emotion. In fact, our emotional brains, both as a species and as individuals, develop before our intellectual brain. Ideally, if the development of our emotional brain, the right side of our brain, is healthy, then the intellect will be in the service of well-being. But if our emotional brain's development is interfered with by negative conditions, such as kids being not picked up and they're crying, such as kids being separated as a punishment from the parents, if they're angry, for example, then that emotional brain will not develop in a healthy way, and the intellect will no longer serve health. In fact, even undermine it, sharp as it can be. So those are the small T traumas. Now let me tell you a horror story. These adverse childhood experiences that I mentioned to you, they've been published in major medical journals for decades now. Major medical journals, developmental journals, psychological journals, journals of addiction. 5 years ago, they're called the ACE studies. And 5 years ago, I was in Norway at a conference on addiction. I was one of the speakers. There were 2 other speakers there who I will not name, but I will tell you, one of them was a leading American psychiatrist, to the extent that he edited one of the editions, or one of the versions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is kind of the Diagnostic Bible of Psychiatry. Very well-known man. The other speaker was a therapist of cognitive behavioral therapy, as high up in the CBT world as you can get. Very well-known name. And we had dinner the night before the conference, and I asked one of them where they lived, and they said lived in a certain city, San Diego. And I said, well, you must know Vincent Felitti. And they said, who's that? I said, well, he's the lead investigator. Filidi is an internal medicine specialist who, working in an obesity clinic, found that they could lose their clients, they could help their clients lose weight, but they cannot help them keep it off. And Filidi did something somewhat unusual for a medical doctor. He started listening to his patients. And he said, what's going on here? And they said, don't we get it? We're stuffing down our pain. They'd all been traumatized in childhood. And that's what gave rise to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. Vince lives in San Diego. This doctor said, who is he? And I said, well, he's the lead author, the lead investigator of the famous AC studies. And both this eminent psychiatrist and this very eminent psychologist said, what are those? They've only been published in 100 journals. Again, I'm talking about the gap between the evidence and the practice of so much medicine and so much even psychology. Now here in Britain, Richard Bentall, who's a well-known psychologist here, and he's a member of the British Academy, I think, and he said that the link between childhood adversity and adult mental health conditions is about as well established scientifically as the link between smoking and lung cancer. And yet, you go to a doctor with your physical health conditions or your mental health conditions, in the face of all this evidence, hardly anybody's going to ever ask you about trauma in your life, about stress in your life, about how you feel about yourself as a human being. Let me come back to healing then, or let me come to healing therefore. So, the effect of all these early developmental factors, whether they are the bad things that happened or the good things that didn't, is that disconnection from the self. So we actually lose our authenticity. We lose our sense of connection to ourselves. And this is something I demonstrate very easily. I do it with all audiences. Allow me to do it with you. Just raise your hand if the following has been true for you, that you had a strong gut feeling about something, you ignored it, and you felt sorry afterwards. Just raise your hand. Well, as always, it's the majority. You just told me about your childhood because you were not born disconnected from your gut feeling. You never met a one-day-old baby disconnected from their body or from their emotions. Not only do they feel them, they immediately express them. And recall that the capacity to experience all our emotions, rage, anger, healthy anger, or any kind of anger for that matter. In a child, there's no unhealthy anger. There is in adults, but not in children. Not in very small children. The joy, the playfulness, the grief, the fear, all these are emotional circuits in our brain. They need to be valued, and their expression needs to be accepted and supported and then channeled in healthy ways by the adults. So when they're not, we lose the connection to ourselves, which I said was the essential trauma. We become inauthentic. And now we start behaving in ways that are determined not by our own needs, not by our own inner sense of ourselves, but by the expectations of the world. And we become just like the characters in Brave New World. We are conditioned to like what we're supposed to do, which has nothing to do with our own needs, but everything to do with the expectations, needs, and values of a society whose fundamental dynamic is the accumulation of wealth and profit. Nothing to do with human needs whatsoever. To the point, and I don't think this is too controversial for me to say, that some of the most successful people in this world, success as measured by the values of this society, are also the ones who profit from the destruction of the world. Just how it is. Even now, with all the evidence about climate change, and even all the corporate advertising about green this and green that, most of the campaign money in the States goes to politicians who either deny or stand in the way of recognizing the devastations of climate change. This on the part of people that are not evil by nature, on the part of people who don't intend to do bad. They just want to make a profit. But if that's what's driving their behavior, they're not going to care what the impact is. And that's the world we live in. So in terms of human nature, just ask yourself this. When are you more at ease? When are you viscerally more at peace? Excuse me. When you've done something selfish and greedy and manipulative, grasping, or when you've been kind and generous and collaborative with other people? When do you feel more at ease internally? When does your body feel better? Most people will say that there's much more peace, much more ease, much more comfort inside their body physiologically when they actually are open-hearted, genuinely, not open-hearted for the sake of being liked or respected, not open-hearted for the sake of being accepted, but open-hearted because it expresses who they are. When do you feel more at ease in your body? Most of you will say, yes, when I'm being open-hearted, kind and generous, not when I'm being greedy, selfish and competitive. Well, that tells you something about what human nature actually is. And so that loss of authenticity, for reasons I will not go into explaining now, but maybe you'll intuit to a significant degree, and you'll certainly get that information in this book and my other books, is that loss of authenticity is a significant cause of illness and distress, physical and mental. And I love quoting Hungarian doctors for some reason, I don't know why. And Dr. János Hans Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, who was the preeminent researcher of stress. In fact, he coined the word stress in a way that we use it today. And he's the one that showed in the laboratory how stressing animals will have physiological impacts on their immune system, on their hormonal apparatus, on their intestines. And Selye was not only a brilliant physician, he was also a brilliant researcher. He was also a humanist. And he wrote in his book on stress, he said that most of our tensions and frustrations come from compulsive needs to act the role of someone that we're not. So inauthenticity is our biggest source of stress, he pointed out. But that inauthenticity, he may not have realized, wasn't our fault, it wasn't kind of a mistake, it wasn't a moral failure, it was an adaptive response to our early environment. So the question then becomes not to judge ourselves for being unauthentic, not to judge ourselves from being disconnected from ourselves, but to understand that actually those were normal responses to an abnormal environment. But if you want to become healthy, guess what? The word health originates in a word for wholeness. So if trauma is the disconnection from ourselves, then health is the reconnection, which is entirely possible, entirely available for us, because that capacity for healing is simply in our nature as organisms. So, and there's a part of us that can never be destroyed. It can be obscured. We can lose connection with it. I certainly have for long periods of my life. But it's always there, as long as there's consciousness. This capacity for healing, for rejoining our disconnected parts, and to become whole and to heal, that's just with us all our lives. And so that I don't have a negative message for you. The message I have is that healing, trauma, daunting and damaging as it can be, both on a social and certainly on an individual level, it can also be healed. Because trauma is not what happened to you, but what happened inside you as a result. And if you're still carrying the imprints and residues of what happened to you, that can be healed. If I got the message that I wasn't worthy and important just for existing, that I had to prove my worth to the world, and that created certain behaviors and on my part, I can actually come to the conclusion it was never true. It was never true that I wasn't worth it. It was never true that you were not worth it. It was never true. It was simply a conclusion you came to as a result of what happened to you. And if you stop trying to prove to the world by being a hard worker or being extraordinarily pleasant or being focusing on your looks all the time or focusing on your successes and achievements, but just dare to show up as the vulnerable creature that we all are and reconnected with your true vulnerable self, which at the time adaptively was too painful for you to experience, but you're no longer that helpless child. Well, then that just means that healing is possible to you. And so let me finish with a quote that somebody sent me tonight. It's about I'm going to finish with two quotes. One is, it follows that when we get ill, not that I recommend this way of learning, but illness can also show up as a teacher. I don't recommend it. I recommend that you do the learning before you get sick. But for a lot of people who do get sick, illness actually functions as a teacher that pretty much calls them back to authenticity and drop the behaviors and self-imposed stresses that their adaptive inauthenticity has imposed on them. And so I'm going to give you one of my favorite quotes. This is from a spiritual teacher. He says, your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard, they're actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed specifically for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. That part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you back to yourself. I was on a podcast this afternoon called Your Failures, or Three Failures, or something about failure, Elizabeth Day, and these failures in my life have certainly been wonderful teachers. A lot of people find that illness is a wonderful teacher. Anyway, they say, that part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You're not going to go in the right direction unless there's something pricking you on the side, telling you, look here, this way. That part of you that loves you so much that it doesn't want you to lose the chance. It will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It'll make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That's its purpose. So the Greek playwright Aeschylus, in his play The Agamemnon, he has the Greek chorus say that the way the master, Zeus, created us human beings, that we have to suffer into truth. And unfortunately, certainly in my life, I think in a lot of people's lives, that's just all too true. We just don't wake up until our somnolence and our sleepwalking causes some problems and some suffering. But we can learn from that suffering. We can actually grow from it. We can heal from it because there's a part of us that was never destroyed. And that's my final quote. It's by the poet John O'Donohue. And he said, our biography is not our full identity. There's a place in the soul where we're not wounded. And that place is always there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I did speak over time, but that's how it went. We'll have time for a few questions. So I think how it's going to work, Vas, is that the ushers will take the mics around. Yeah. Just identify where you are when or the usher will identify. Okay, yeah?
Is that working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You talked about the healing, and would you say that at any age or stage the healing is possible, whether you're a child or whether you're 70 or 80?
Yeah.
Just make a start.
Well, it's always available because the healing is part of the nature of any organism. So it's a question of how much consciousness, awareness, and how much support there is. But it's certainly possible at any age, any stage of life. I've seen people heal even when they were dying. By healing, I didn't mean that they got cured. They didn't. But strangely enough, at least it may seem strange, when I was working in palliative care, looking after terminally ill people, it wasn't unusual for somebody to say to me, even in the face of death, that, you know, doctor, I don't know how to explain this to you, but this terminal illness is the best thing that ever happened to me. Because in confronting death, and in confronting some of the factors that made them ill in the first place, they reconnected with themselves, which is what somebody has called the precious pearl. Now, I don't recommend that way of learning again. All I'm saying is that even in that terminal phase, healing is possible, even when cure is not sometimes. Now, on the other hand, I can also tell you, as I do in this book, that, and as Jeff Rediger has documented as well, is that once you reconnect with your authentic self, a lot of medical conditions can abate and even remit completely. I'm not promising that. I'm just saying I've seen it too often. And there's too many examples also written up in the literature. So that, yeah, healing is always possible, as long as there's consciousness. Okay?
I'd like to thank you so much for you actually, I was broken a year and a half ago. Coming to see you on YouTube and then following you actually saved me. As a lifelong activist, political activist from Iran, I've suffered a lot of small t trauma. And I was just thinking, okay, maybe now my body says no, so I should maybe rest it. And I read The Myth of Normal. You're getting me back where I was. What you're describing that I totally agree with, you cannot just heal with medicine or just with yoga or individually. It needs a collective action to change the society. Poverty, racism, all those you talk about, which I totally agree, cannot be solved with me just doing yoga or meditation or mindfulness.
Well, yeah.
Isn't that actually really what you're saying, that we need collective action to change the society?
Well, you took the words. You took the words right out of my mouth, or out of my book, I should say, because in the chapter on individual healing, we present the 4 A's of authenticity, agency, anger, and acceptance. In the final chapter, we add 2 more. One of them is activism. So, yeah.
I haven't read yet. I just got there to that chapter, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay, so yeah. One of the toxicities of this culture is a kind of passivity that it inculcates into our social character. Social character being a phrase of the great psychologist Erich Fromm. And social character is kind of the persona that we take on in response to the expectations of society. And in the collective sense, we're far more passive and even non-compassionate than we are as individuals. Because as individuals, at least most of us will feel bad on seeing a homeless person. Mm-hmm. But as a social collective, we put up with it. Mm-hmm. As individuals, nobody wants climate change. Nobody wants it. Some people want to profit from it, but nobody wants the climate change as such. And it's, according to all kinds of evidence, it is the greatest threat ever facing mankind. We're completely passive in the face of it. And that passivity is inculcated in us by this culture. It's one of the ways that the culture survives, is by inducing this passivity. So yes, activism is very much one of the antidotes to that.
Yeah.
Okay? Mm-hmm.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Dr. Gabor Maté, for everything you do in all your books and for me personally. I'm a medical profession. I apologize for my people. Just today, I was in the operating theatre talking to my trainee about your books and how illness has come about, because we were talking about cancer. And you said in your talk today about how 2 eminent psychiatrists or in that field didn't even know about the ACEs.
That's right.
How would you suggest that we go about waking up the medical profession?
Well, here's the problem. You heard the expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can't even lead the horse to water. I don't have a clear idea. What I do know is that I hear from more and more physicians and medical people like yourself who are waking up. And all we can do, is any one of us, is to speak out about these realities as loudly and as large a platform as is available to us. I happen to have a fairly broad platform these days, but at whatever platform you have, you just have to speak these truths. Now let me tell you a story. There's a rheumatologist at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, who read my book, When the Body Says No, and she realized that these autoimmune conditions have everything to do with people's emotional lives. And she started practicing that. She started talking to people about their traumas and their stresses. And she says, I'm getting remarkable results. I'm getting people off medications. But she says, you can't use my name in your book because my colleagues will reject me for it. That's how bad it is in some places. I got an email from a British physician who says, oh my God, I found your work and thank God, finally sees it the same way I do. But who do I connect with here in Britain that sees it the same way? I didn't know, well, I connected him with Rangan Chatterjee, who's a well-known physician here and podcaster. I got an email from a professor at one of the two very prestigious British universities who is suffering all manner of physical ailments that he now recognizes are connected to his emotional life at his prestigious university, who couldn't find a single psychiatrist who understood what he was talking about. So he writes me in Canada to see what help I can offer. And the problem is the training of physicians, as you know, just doesn't talk about these things. An even bigger problem is the nature of medical training itself. I mean, as somebody once said, how do you create a cult? Well, you isolate people from their families, you put them under authority and leaders, you give them a uniform and a special jargon only they can understand, and you deprive them of sleep. In other words, you send them to medical school, you know? Medical school itself is a very traumatic experience for a lot of its practitioners. And the last thing they're ever allowed to do is to feel vulnerable, to feel that this is too much, to complain. Because then you're not a team member and you're not strong enough for this profession. That means that, not even to mention, I don't know about yourself, but my going to medicine wasn't purely out of idealism or a professional curiosity. It was also a need to make myself important. So I was very driven to work like that, to prove my importance, because I got the message that I wasn't. So these are the people that often go into medicine. The training itself is often traumatizing. The work itself is very stressful. The information is completely lacking in a medical training, despite all the scientific evidence. It's a huge challenge that your question poses. All I can say is that the public itself has to demand this as loudly and as clearly as possible, and that those physicians and those medical people like you and I need to advocate for this point of view. And I think it's going to happen. I think it is happening bit by bit, but it's going to be daunting. And it's not going to be a very thankful task for a long time. That's just how it is.
Hello.
Hi.
First, I'd like to thank you so much for all the work that you do and for all the ripple effect that you're creating in the world, which is inspiring many of us to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
In my case, I've been reading, as a therapist, I've been reading also about the possibilities of re-traumatization in the healing process.
Mm-hmm. How so?
And
How so?
I'm actually trying to find out what would be the common thread that would produce that in certain cases? Would it be the unwillingness to go through the healing process, or do you have any ideas?
No.
Thank you.
Most of the people who talk about re-traumatization just haven't dealt with their own trauma. And they're projecting their own fear onto their clients. That's the first point. The second point is that the original trauma occurred precisely because the child wasn't safe. It wasn't because there was pain. Life brings pain. That's the nature of life. Not that it has to, it's just that it does. Your puppy dog will die. Your grandfather may not feel like seeing you one day. Your parents may have a fight. So pain is almost unavoidable. Pain is not the problem. The pain is that the child is alone with the pain. So can't process it. So has to disconnect. That's what the problem is, because there's no safety. Now, the original pain was incurred when the child is absolutely alone, helpless, and without support. In a therapeutic setting, if you as the therapist provide safety, that person may experience pain. In fact, you hope that they will. Not that you will deliberately evoke the pain or cause it somehow, but just the fact of healing. When you look at what happened, you realize there's a lot of pain inside me. That's not re-traumatizing. That's actually healing. Because now you're experiencing the pain in a safe context, where you're being heard and validated and witnessed and supported. Why would that be re-traumatizing? So no, the answer is no. On the other hand, if the therapy is inept, if the therapist hasn't dealt with their own stuff, then it's entirely possible that something will happen that will reinforce the trauma that's already there. But I'd say that depends on the kind of therapy and therapist that is being provided. It's not an intrinsic attribute of the therapeutic process. Okay? Thank you.